On this day, the Lords would arrive in Sanctuary, and they would not receive the warmest of welcomes from those that they would have left to die. As for how this goes from here, well, I'll go into that. Around this time, there was some forward planning. Forward planning involving an expansion of... Oh yes, and when Hangman's Hill, a resentful engineer apparently cursed those who would take his tools, apparently being lied to. Although the leader of Sanctuary, let us just say she... The Lords were nearly there. There were many of them, but they looked miserable. They seemed to carry no food supplies. When they reached their city in a few hours from that point, they'd have no choice but to beg them for help. She would have to decide their fates. Yes. A difficult decision indeed. As for the hanged man and his tools, the tools were buried with him, as she was quite respectful of the dead. That, and she suspected that the steam cores among the tools were tampered with. Well, she didn't know for certain, but it wasn't something she was willing to put to the test. Not only was a coal mine constructed, but a hothouse was as well. As more food would be needed to sustain the larger population. Thankfully, shelter been accounted for. And once the steam hub was operational in the southeast, construction of the additional hothouse and coal mine resumed. The history of Sanctuary sounded like an uphill struggle, did it not? More so than our city. Winterhome was a losing battle. The Lords had arrived. They were starving. There was at least 100 of them. 100! And more were coming. They begged them to let them in. But that would mean sharing their food supplies and finding them shelter. She let them in and promised to meet their needs when it comes to nourishment. Although, at least one ranted angrily about that. She let him speak. And just as they arrived, mechanical calculators were developed, and the Lords arrived wearing rags and thanked her for letting them in. And a higher heat setting was under development. At that point, because there was not enough metal. And by this point, the situation with the housing was not good, I shall say that much. As the people needed their homes to be warm for 2 days. Well, warm enough to be acceptable anyway. Yes, and another sawmill could be built closer to the source of wood. Although, it was not something that they were going to run out of anytime soon. Certainly not with the wall drill. Oh yes, and as for the wrecked vehicle, there was coal and steel there. The steam lorry was next for that scout party. Yes, many supplies would be located. And there was enough food to go around. Oh yes, and speaking of food, an additional cookhouse was necessary, because one cookhouse was clearly not enough to prepare enough for the entire population, including the lords that had arrived. The overdrive was needed, at least until an increased amount of heat was provided. Although there was enough steel to improve two of the hunters' hangars. Well, two of the hunters' huts into hangars to provide more food. And that would need to be proactively increased, because from the first group of lords... Oh yes, and speaking of them, one of them was having difficulty adjusting. So she decided to give him time to adjust, even though it made a few resentful, confusing that for preferential treatment. When in fact, it was taking all the different factors into consideration. One of them being the cold environment that we were in would tolerate no weakness. Although the same could not be said about those that lived within it. Up to a point, of course. The people were left to eat. Those that needed it. As for the lord that had difficulty adjusting to the current circumstances, well, he saw that there was a need to work in these troubled times. Oh yes, and in the middle of the night, the ocean liner was reached, and it made for some grim reading. As they found out that the lords, under the orders of Lord Craven, the one in charge, order that they attempted to shoot the ships that contained the poor that would have been left to die. Yes. Grim reading indeed. Where it confirmed the suspicions of the People's Sanctuary. Although so far, they seem to be quite tolerant. The second group of lords was approaching. In less than 2 days, they would arrive in Sanctuary. And this would mean more shelter would need to be constructed. Thankfully, there was some space for that. Space to the east. Although, as for the medical situation, that was also something that needed to be improved, as it was starting to overwhelm. As for the steam lorry, that had steel and some much-needed steam cores. A damaged snowcat was in the distance from that location. It would be the next destination. Perhaps with all that steel, it would be enough for, well, improving the housing within the Sanctuary. The lords arrived in Sanctuary, and more were coming. What would they bring with them? Time would tell that answer. But they would need to be prepared for regardless. The overdrive by this point could be safely disengaged, at least for the time being. And it was at this point that medical facilities needed improvement. The same could be said about the amount of shelter. Specifically, shelter for those that would be arriving quite soon. Which would need a road and a steam core. Sorry, a steam hub for the space in between. And with 2 cookhouses, there was enough for all to eat. At least for now. And not with soup. Yes, that was a measure of desperation. It was displeasing, but it was better than starving to death. At least by this point, there was no need for it. One of the lords alerted the leader of Sanctuary to a radio mast. A location of interest that was worth investigating at some point, although the main concern right now was expanding the amount of shelter for those that would be arriving. A woman was being indignant towards the last patrol's less than professional attitude. They were disciplined, as that kind of behavior had no place in what they were supposed to be doing. And at this point, more tents were being set up. There was even an idea to put a guard station somewhere in the middle of them. Roads that led to them would be needed. and they were provided. At least they would be ready by the time the second group of lords arrived at Sanctuary. Oh yes, and with the current medical facilities improved, it was time for the next project to be researched. And that would be the infirmary. A proper building for that rather than medical posts. The damaged snowcat had steel, of course. All those supplies were transported back to Sanctuary. Well, those steam cores would be needed quite soon. Although there was the question of where to put the infirmary. Perhaps to the west, where there was still plenty of room for it. Well, most of the rest of the space for buildings was taken. As for the need for the overdrive, that would be needed to fulfill the promise to the people regarding heating their homes for 2 days. As it would break the promise for some strange reason if their homes were improved during this time. Oh yes, and a steam hub was constructed. Expanding the heat farther west. Well, it couldn't hurt to be prepared for what was to come.
Workday end. It's time for rest.
Much as there was more shelter for those that needed it. The end of one work shift heralded another. Where the hunters flew away to hunt for more food. Soon there would be a need to improve the hothouses. But that would wait until later. As for where to put the infirmary, it's... Sorry, why do I keep doing that? That involved dismantling one sawmill and moving it closer to the wood. That way there would be plenty of room for... it's acting up again. If the manufacturers of this recording device weren't already dead by being frozen to death, I would have delivered a painful blow to their nether regions. That is how vexed I'm feeling right now. Although I suspect that one infirmary might not be enough for the needs of all those people. Well, it was better to be too prepared than woefully ill-prepared. Yeah. I don't know why I said it like that. Yes, of course it was not a good thing to be woefully ill-prepared. Because it meant that oh yes, and the radio mast was where one of the scout parties was redirected. Well, they're heading in that general direction anyway, so why not? Whoever made this device needs to stick it up their big, self-important... a little coal, quite a bit of steel, and steam cores. Precious steam cores! Oh yes, and... it was decided that it wouldn't hurt to expand the heat zone, bridging a gap. Especially as it would also mean more in the way of construction potential. A snowy hill was the next destination of that scout party. Oh yes, and it was a good idea to put the overdrive back on, considering that the cold would rather increase.
Brace yourselves. Cold is coming.
It was at least tolerable to those within the city, because it meant that it was at least tolerable. Although
We must work harder.
the second group was approaching. So, as we've already determined by this point, things could change very quickly. And they have changed quickly. Quite a few times so far. The second group of lords grew near, and there was fewer places for the scout parties to explore. Although that meant that more would be coming into Sanctuary, even though there'd be a wait for it.